Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Becca and this is my sewing, craft, and lifestyle channel. I'm so glad that you're joining me today. We are talking about how to start sewing in 2022. Basically a complete guide to starting to sew clothes, quilts, repairing garments, whatever it is that you want to do, you're gonna know how to do it after you watch this video. Or at least have a good idea of how to get started. I grew up in a very crafty family, so I've always been surrounded by people who knew how to sew. I actually started sewing on my grandmother's machine from the 60s. I have memories of my mom making my Halloween costumes as a child. And then actually when I was in middle school, the first time I ever sewed was because I wanted skinny jeans, but for whatever reason, I could not get skinny jeans. So I decided to go to the thrift store with my best friend and we thrifted some wide leg jeans and made them into skinny jeans. And I don't remember mine being particularly good, but I feel like it was good enough to wear and I was pretty proud of them. I didn't really sew at all again until I got into college. I wanted to make a pillow. Actually, I'm gonna go grab the pillow, hold on. Here it is. I was totally obsessed with Rifle Paper Company and I had the fabric, like I just bought it because I liked it. And here it is. You can see my cute little stitches right there with my unmatching thread. But yeah, this was my first sewing project back and I'm gonna talk about some beginner sewing projects that you can try out. Let's get started talking about how you can get started sewing this year. The first thing I want you to do when you decide that you want to make clothing, I want you to find a piece of clothing in your closet that you really like and turn it inside out. So that way you can see all of the seams and all of the work that went into making your garment. Because I think a lot of the times maybe not a lot of the time, I think all the time until we actually make our own clothes, we don't actually understand how much work goes into each and every piece of clothing that we wear. There's a lot of cutting, there's a lot of sewing, there's a lot of skills that go into it. And I think actually looking at a garment inside out and sort of looking at it as a puzzle that's already been put together will really give you a good springboard to understand how clothing is even assembled. So when you're doing sewing, you're probably going to be needing a sewing machine. A lot of sewing can be done by hand, and of course this is how it was done before sewing machines were invented, but sewing machines have been invented and I think that we should utilize them when we can. The sewing machine that I recommend to anyone just starting out is the Singer Heavy Duty, and that is because it is a mechanical sewing machine. So in the world of sewing machines, you have computerized sewing machines and mechanical machines. My first machine was a mechanical and I've since upgraded to a computerized machine, and computerized literally just means that there's a computer inside of it. It has a lot more features. It does a lot more things for you, like setting the tension and lots of other features that you might not need at this point. And you might also not want to be making that big of an investment because computerized sewing machines are much more expensive. I am posting this video right at the new year, so Christmas has just happened, which means that a lot of people were gifted sewing machines that they are never going to use. So oftentimes I will find sewing machines on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or wherever, Kijiji, wherever you buy things secondhand. You could probably find a sewing machine. I actually purchased one of my sewing machines, my serger, from a bookstore that was like a secondhand bookstore that also had some home stuff, so you could also find them thrifting. But the only thing is, if you do buy it secondhand, unless it is brand new in the box or barely used and you know for sure it's barely used, I would highly suggest getting it serviced. Think about sewing machines like you think about cars. So cars, you buy a car from a dealership, so there's lots of different dealers around town for different brands. It's the same for sewing machines. So I'm going to put on the screen all of the different sewing machine brands. As you can see, there are a lot to choose from. My machine right here is a Husqvarna Viking. My machine prior to this was a Singer, and my serger is a Brother. So I have a lot of different brands in my home and I've liked all of them so far. So honestly, I feel like as long as you do your research and you find out which brand would be best for your lifestyle, you'll be fine, but definitely put in a lot of research. If you don't feel like doing research, again, the Singer Heavy Duty is a really great option. There is a bottom tier Singer Heavy Duty and then one that has like a few more features. Just depends on how much you're wanting to spend because either one is pretty affordable, all things considered. So back to the dealership thing. I bought my sewing machine from a dealer, or it's not a dealer, from a sewing shop that sells Husqvarna Viking and Bernina, which are two pretty popular sewing machine brands. This is a specialized sewing shop, and sometimes sewing shops will also be a sewing and vacuum shop. I don't know why the two are usually connected, but a lot of the places that I've been have also had like a vacuum repair service. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that most of the time those companies are locally owned or small businesses. So it's really great to support small businesses when we can, of course. And that's a really great way to do that, is by buying a machine from a local retail seller. You can of course also buy them online from lots of different places, or also in your local Joann's. I don't know if Michael's sells sewing machines. I think some locations might, but Joann definitely does sell sewing machines, and you can certainly find the Singer Heavy Duty at your local Joann. This part of the process is definitely a lot of research, because you want to find a good machine that'll be worthy of an investment, and definitely going into those sewing shops and just trying out some of the machines. It's like test driving a car. You get to go in and try out different machines, and there's usually somebody, like a salesperson, usually it's just like a grandma who like loves sewing machines, and they show you how to work each different machine and sort of show you all the different features, and you can get a feel for what you're wanting. And I'm sure that if they didn't have the sewing machine in stock that you were wanting, you could probably order it through them. And another big perk of buying a sewing machine from a local sewing shop is that usually when you buy a machine, you get lessons with it. So I bought this machine from a local place here in Columbia, Missouri, where I live. It's called Apple Tree Quilting, I believe. And I actually got 2 classes to learn how to use my machine, and they were completely free. And I think each class was like 2 hours long. So it was like 4 hours of free sewing lessons that I got just for buying a sewing machine. The next category with getting started sewing is tools that you're going to need. So there's lots of different sewing tools out there, but I'm going to start with the bare minimum, bare necessity tools just to get started. First and most obviously, you're going to be needing scissors. Now there's different types of sewing scissors out there. There are small snips and there are larger scissors that you can like put in your whole hand. And of course there are the left-handed scissors, right-handed scissors, and no-handed scissors. I am left-handed, and it has been really hard for me to find left-handed scissors, but I eventually did find them, and it's the greatest thing in the world. The reason that I say buy specifically fabric scissors is that they're very, very sharp and really great for cutting through fabric. The scissors will get dull eventually, but you can buy sharpeners to keep them sharp. And in order to keep them sharp for longer, I would highly suggest not using them on anything besides your fabric. So your fabric scissors are your coveted scissors. They are yours. You put your name on them, you put them in a drawer, and you hide them away so that nobody will accidentally use them to cut out some paper. I have used them before on paper, and it's not the end of the world, but you know, just try not to do it. You're also going to need pins, and the reason you need pins is to hold pieces of fabric together as you sew them, and also to hold the pattern to the fabric as you're cutting. Pins just help everything stay accurate and straight. Sometimes I see people sewing without pins, and unless you're very skilled, I think that it's a little bit risky. There are certain cases, like when you're just sewing a straight line and you feel comfortable with your machine, you don't need to use pins, but I would say especially in the beginning, you need to be pinning every single seam that you sew. There's lots of different types of pins. There are pins that have a ball at the top of it. I try to get ones with a like bright colored ball, because if I drop them, they're a lot easier to see, and you'd be surprised with how many times you drop pins actually, and you really don't want to step on them on accident or have somebody else step on them. So make sure that you have pins that are visible. They are like maybe 50 cents more, maybe $1 more, but honestly I think it's worth it, because you buy a little box of pins and you probably won't need to replace them for years. Also, something to note, there are glass head pins and then plastic head pins. They say that if you want to iron over your pins, you should get glass head pins, but I have plastic head pins and I iron over them. I haven't noticed any issues, but I'm also not holding the iron on them for very long. So just something to note as well. And along with pins, you're going to need a pin cushion. There's lots of options for pin cushions out there. If you get the classic tomato pin cushion, that's like, I don't know, a rite of passage. The tomato pin cushion also has like a little string with like a tiny little pepper thing attached to it. And that is actually a sharpener for your pins, because your pins will get dull. And when you're pinning into fabric, it's better that your pins are as sharp as possible. Depending on the type of fabric you're working with, if you're working with a stretch fabric, you would want like a ballpoint pin. But for general use, when you're pinning your garments, you want that pin to be super sharp so that it can just slice right through the fabric and not cause any extra pulling or tears. I personally have a pin cushion that I keep on my wrist, but that was something that I bought later. It definitely wasn't a first pin cushion purchase. And then there's also, instead of a pin cushion, you can get a little magnetic tray if you just want to do it that way instead. Your best friend in your sewing journey is going to be a seam ripper. Now, if you buy like a sewing kit, it'll have a lot of these bare necessity items in it, but I would suggest, if you want to get the sewing kit, totally do that. But I would also suggest getting an upgraded seam ripper. So I have a seam ripper that has like a long handle and like some grippies on it, because tiny little seam rippers that come in the kits are usually like, I don't know, 2-3 inches long. And it's really, really difficult to use them after, well, I wouldn't say it's really difficult. It just kind of hurts and it's inconvenient to use that tiny little seam ripper when you are undoing seams, maybe from like a long piece of fabric. If you think that you're not going to be unpicking seams, you're definitely wrong. I've been sewing for a couple of years now and I'm still always unpicking. And I actually used to avoid unpicking and would just kind of like blaze through my makes without, like, with all my mistakes still intact, thinking that it would be fine. But that's obviously not a good way to sew. The seam ripper is sort of like the Command Z of the sewing world. So make sure that you have a good one. You'll thank me later. Something that really helped me early on is having chalk so that I could mark certain parts of the garment. Like if there are darts in a garment or if there are certain places where a buttonhole would go, I would really suggest getting chalk, tailor's chalk, or dissolvable ink pens. Dissolvable ink pens, basically you write on it. It's usually blue. You can write on the fabric and then you can just like get your finger wet and like rub it off. It's actually magic and really, really cool. Next, you're going to need a measuring tape, because now that you've entered the sewing your own garments land, you have to throw out the small, medium, large, extra large, 2X, 3X, whatever size that you had before, because the sewing world is very different as far as sizing goes, and it's much less focused on the number or the letter assigned to your size and much more focused on just the numbers around your body. So when you're preparing to sew your garment, you sit down with the instructions, and of course the pattern is going to tell you how much fabric you need based on your size, and then the size chart is made up of measurements of your bust, waist, hips typically, sometimes also like your arm, just depends on how tight or loose or whatever places the garment is going to be hitting where it's important, that is where you're going to be measuring. So having a sewing tape measure is really important to help you with that, and just depending on where the pattern is coming from, you want one that has centimeters and inches. The last absolute essential that I think that you should have for your beginning sewing journey is colorful tape. And the reason that I say this is that it's really hard to feed the fabric through your machine in a straight line. So actually when I first started driving, it was really hard for me to like not jerk the wheel around. And as I sort of, you know, grew up and drove more, I noticed that the movements that I have with the wheel are like tiny, right? So like we don't even notice that we're doing it anymore, but when you first start driving, it's like really hard to keep the wheel straight. So it's the same thing with sewing. Honestly, there's so many connections to driving and sewing. Anyway, point is, it can be really difficult to keep the fabric straight, and if you have a really, really clear line that you cannot cross, it's very helpful. So even if you're using painter's tape, you can also use washi tape, electrical tape, just some sort of colorful tape to put on your machine so that you are sewing in a straight line along your seam allowance. And the seam allowance is the amount of space that you sew from the edge of the fabric into the inside of the fabric. So usually it'll be like 3/8 of an inch or 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that just sort of helps you know how much space to give yourself. And you can measure out from your needle to the point where you lay your tape how big that is, and then you will always have a perfect seam allowance. And straight lines, which is probably the most important part. There are some extra tools that I wanted to mention, but I'm going to go through these a little bit faster because if you're very, very beginner, you might not need to even worry about these yet. But one of them is a bodkin, and that is basically a little set of tweezers that you keep for yourself in your sewing stash. It's a set of tweezers with a little metal circle that you can move to make the tweezers stay in one place and hold on to something. And this is really helpful when you're threading elastic through a garment. It's one of the things that I felt like I didn't need for so long, so I didn't buy it. And then when I bought it, I wondered how I went so long without it. So usually people will use like a safety pin or something like that, but a bodkin is much longer, so I just find it a lot easier to find when I'm threading elastic through a piece of fabric. Next is a cutting mat. So a cutting mat is especially helpful if you are doing any sort of quilting or if you're cutting a lot of squares or anything like that in general. And with a cutting mat, you're also going to need a rotary cutter, which is basically a pizza cutter for your fabric, and it makes cutting a lot faster. And I like it specifically when I'm cutting a lot of straight lines. I don't find that it's very great if I'm doing a lot of curves because it's just a lot harder to navigate, but it's a really great thing to have because it really speeds up if you're cutting a lot of things. Pinking shears are another type of scissors, and it's basically scissors with a jagged edge, and that's really helpful if you're cutting out fabric that has a tendency to fray, because with the pinking shears it will not fray, or it'll fray like way less than it would if you're cutting with straight scissors. And this is actually something that I have not purchased yet, but I've been really thinking about it because I work with linen all the time and I think it would be really helpful for me, so I think I'm gonna make the investment. It's hardly an investment. I'm pretty sure you can get them for like 10 or 12 bucks. Next, another alternative to pins are clips. The brand that I got mine from, I think they're called Wonder Clips, and it's basically just like tiny little clips that they kind of look like miniature sandwich bag clips, and you can use that to put together all of your fabric as you're sewing. And it's better for fabric that would show the holes from the pins, like working with leather or working with like a satin or something like that. The holes tend to stay, so if you wanted to not have that happen, you can definitely use clips instead. I see a lot of people using them with like bag making or whatever else. It's really helpful for me with quilting. And then speaking of quilting, I really suggest you get a clear ruler. And I've had mine for a long time, like way before I ever even got into quilting. And I used it all the time just to measure, like if I'm doing a self-drafted pattern, it's just helpful to have like a hard clear ruler so that you can see like how deep you're cutting in. The measuring tape is really great, but also it's floppy, so it's helpful to have something solid and longer. And you can usually find those in the quilting section of your local sewing shop. All right, are you still with me? I feel like I should check in. I've been talking for a long time, so hope that you're enjoying the video. And next I want to talk about fabric and notions. Notions are basically just things that make your garment work, like zippers or buttons. As we start this discussion on fabric, I want to make it very clear that sewing is not exactly a cheap hobby to get into. I mean, you've probably already figured it out with all these tools that you need to get started, and then the sewing machine, and then you get to the fabric. Now, if you were to go to the fabric store, you will see that fabric is usually like on average between $7 to $25 a yard, and sometimes you can even find fabric online from different specialty shops for like $25 per half a yard or half meter. So it can be expensive, and you'll quickly realize that if you started sewing because you wanted to make clothes for cheaper, that's probably not going to be a thing. And it's really, this is one of the things that really was so jarring to me when I first started sewing, because I thought to myself, why is it more expensive to make my own clothes than it is for me to just go buy them? And that really is a byproduct of fast fashion, which is a really horrible thing for the environment and for the garment industry and all of its workers, and also us, because it really gives us this false idea of what it takes to create garments and how expensive it actually is to make things. Sustainable fashion is something that I'm super like fired up and passionate about, but so I don't want to like go into it too much in this video, but I would highly suggest looking more into the sustainable fashion movement and just seeing the, I don't know, dark spot that fashion is on the environment and what, I don't know, just what we can do to help, and companies that we can support or not support who are doing good or bad things for this movement. With that being said, I really enjoy working mostly with thrifted fabrics. Now, I don't always work with thrifted fabrics for sure, but if you're just getting started out, I would highly suggest going to the thrift store, going to the bedding section and finding cotton sheets or linen curtains. Finding big cuts of fabric. Now you're gonna see everything as fabric, by the way, now that you've started sewing, because I cannot look at a pair of sheets and think to myself, those would be really beautiful sheets. All I think about is, that's some really beautiful fabric that I can cut and make a dress. So if you do start by sewing on really affordable things like thrifted sheets, thrifted curtains, all of that kind of stuff, thrifted duvet covers would be amazing as well, that is going to significantly decrease the amount of money that you're spending right off when you start sewing, because again, it is very expensive to get started. I would say go for bigger sheet sets like queen, full, or kings. Twin size sheet sets aren't that big actually, and also it's kind of difficult to find a full sheet set. And you know, depending on the era that the sheets are from, you can find some with really cute floral patterns and they're really fun to work with. But I would definitely say if you can find the fabric content of the sheets, make sure that they are linen or cotton or something like that, because if they are a polyester, they're a little bit less comfortable and more staticky and just not as fun to wear. Probably also not that fun to sleep in, but definitely not that fun to wear. And also I say to stick with linen and cotton, specifically bed sheets, because this fabric is the typical weight of fabric that you're going to sew with for clothing. So fabric weight is basically just how thick the fabric is. So this is just like a cotton fabric. So it doesn't have like a very big weight. Like it's not bulky by any means. It's very, it's a little stiff. That's kind of cute. Anyway, yeah, it's not very thick by any means. Curtains have a tendency to be a little bit thicker, so those would be great for like trying out different pants patterns or maybe even like a specific dress or like a structured blouse. But typically you want to stick more to the thinner, lighter fabrics because those are a lot easier to work with and they're not as much pressure on your sewing machine. Also, cotton and linen in general is very easy to sew with because it doesn't slink around. It's very stable. So that's also very helpful when you're just getting started. Like when you're trying to learn how to sew straight and then your fabric is moving around, that's very difficult. So these fabrics will like adhere to each other, not in a bad way, but they just like don't slide very easily. So it's just a lot better to start with those. And not to mention, cotton and linen is biodegradable materials, like they are plant-based. So most of my wardrobe is cotton and linen, mostly for that reason. I try to stay away from synthetic materials just because I don't find them very comfortable and they're not really that great for the environment either. If you're wanting to buy cuts of fabric after you've practiced a lot on sheets and curtains and whatever else you're practicing on, definitely check out a local fabric store where you can go in and touch the fabric. Now, if you go to a quilting shop, they probably are not going to have a lot for garment fabric. Now, garment fabric is a little bit different than quilting fabric. This shirt is actually made from quilting fabric, but it's a little bit stiff. It doesn't have very good drape, so it's not my go-to for sure. I actually used it on this pattern because I wanted to try out the pattern. So quilting cotton does tend to be a lot cheaper. So if you're wanting to make something called a toile, which is basically like a practice run of a garment, you can definitely use like a cheaper muslin fabric or quilting fabric, or again, bed sheets, to try out the pattern first before you cut into your more expensive cuts of fabric that you got from, let's say, a specialty garment fabric store. Near me, I don't have any specialty garment fabric stores, so I tend to buy online if I'm going to do that. Or I also pop into my local Joann because they have a really great selection of garment fabrics. Some really great online fabric stores are number one, Blackbird Fabrics. They are my favorite fabric company online. They sell out of Canada and they do ship internationally. I believe that Stone Mountain and Daughter is out of Colorado. I could be wrong, but I've also ordered from them and they have really great stuff. And then there's also something called Spoonflower, which is where you can go on and get specialty fabric made from artist designs. So there's lots of artists on Spoonflower. Think of it like Etsy a little bit. I don't know, how do you explain it? It's like ordering a pizza, right? So you pick your fabric type and then you pick the design that you want to get printed onto it. And Spoonflower has really great like eco practices, so I really like them as well. And then of course Etsy always has people selling fabric. I would be careful with Etsy. Make sure that they have really good photos and that there's like photos of the fabric draping. Make sure that the photos have good lighting so that you can see an accurate depiction of the colors. And really that's with any online fabric shopping. Like there's a lot to know with online fabric shopping, and sometimes it's hard to know what a certain fabric is going to feel like until it's in person with you. So that's why I always suggest going to a place like Joann, or if you can go into a specialty garment fabric store to actually touch and see what silk feels like to actually touch and see what viscose feels like, because there's so many different types of fabric. And for me, that's even a challenge still because I don't know what tencel feels like. You know what I mean? And there's so many different types of fabric, and it's sort of like a guessing game sometimes when I order online. Like cotton jersey, I just ordered that and I was like, oh, that's what cotton jersey is. But a lot of these places also allow you to order samples. So if you're really not wanting to make the investment before you know for sure what the fabric is like, then you can also order a sample for probably like $5 or something. Okay, so let's talk about thread. Thread is one of those things that I absolutely did not pay attention to until I took those sewing classes about a year ago after I bought my machine. So when I was talking to the woman who was, teaching me the lessons, she was asking me what sort of thread that I normally use. And I told her that I typically just use thread that was passed down to me because my sewing machine, my old one, came with like a whole box of thread. So that's just what I was using. And she told me that that might be messing with the integrity of my garments because I told her that a lot of my garments had a tendency to fall apart. She was totally right. I looked back at the thread that I was using and I sort of did a thread check, like I pulled on it to see how well it held up, and it totally broke as soon as I pulled on it, and it was like shedding. Like, you know how our fabric, like in our sweaters, can like pill? Well, thread can sort of do that by like letting, I don't know how to explain it, but it just looks like fuzzy when it's not supposed to be. So that was a lot of the thread that I was working with in the beginning. And now at this point, I don't use that anymore because again, it actually broke if I just pulled it a little bit. But now I use higher quality thread, and it's not something that you have to do right away, but I like to use Gutterman thread because it is all around really nice thread. Also, something to know is different fabrics will like different types of thread. So there's lots of different kinds of thread as well. So you have the all-purpose thread, you've got like the cotton thread, you have nylon thread, which has a little bit more of a stretch. So just depending on the type of materials you're sewing with, make sure that you have the right thread. And I'm not gonna have all that information for you here because that's a little bit deeper, but just do a quick Google and find out what thread to use with X type of fabric, and that should be super helpful for you. Okay, let's quickly talk about what should be your first sewing project. Now, a lot of people will suggest you make like a pillowcase as your first project or something like that, something with straight lines that it's hard to mess up, right? So I would sort of agree with that. I think that that's a really great place to start, but if you really don't need a pillowcase and you really don't think you're ever gonna use it, maybe don't do something like that because you don't wanna waste the fabric. I made a tutorial on my channel a couple months ago where I showed you how to make this bathroom bag setup that I have. That is also using a square shape basically, but it's using two different types of fabric, and it was really, really simple to make. So I'm going to link that down below if you're interested in that for your first sewing project. And then also in the times of COVID-19, face masks are a big thing that people learned how to sew to make. So face masks are just if you do like a classic one, it's just a rectangle, and that is probably the easiest thing that you can sew. It's just a rectangle. You add a few ruffles in it or like a fold in it to like make it 3D so that it can fit over your nose. That's a great place to start too. And a lot of people are still wearing them. So that's a really great first sewing project as well. When I first started sewing, I discovered fabricsstore.com, and they have a ton of free tutorials and patterns for you to just download and make. And from them, I made the Moroccan inspired pants and the apron tank. And both of those were really great first projects. They were definitely, I think those were the first couple of things that I made, and I still wear them today. Maybe not the apron tank as much, but I definitely still use the Moroccan pants as like pajamas or something like that. And I made that out of sheets. So definitely check out their website and see if there's any tutorials that stick out to you. I will try to link down below some good ones if you want to try them out. The Moroccan pants and the apron tank were both really awesome. If you are ready to purchase a pattern, I would highly, highly suggest the Ogden Cami by True Bias. That is an independent pattern maker, True Bias, and they have a lot of really great patterns on their website, but my favorite is definitely the Ogden Cami. I have made so many different Ogden Camis in my life, and I find that to be a very, very easy, straightforward pattern. And anytime somebody asks me to teach them how to sew, that is always the pattern that I pull out and have them make, because not only are you learning how to sew with straight lines, you are doing a little bit of curves, and you're also, making a garment. So you can wear it and you can feel it and you can see what it feels like to make something that you can wear. And also you can understand, again, how clothing works, and then you can feel in the garment, what you would want to change. Because when we buy clothing from the store, you can't exactly just take it apart and redo it because the fabric has already been cut. Now, when you make your own clothes, you can do that. You know, I mean, you might have to start over, but there's a lot of things that you can adjust and fit to your body specifically. Like for me, for example, I usually have to do some sort of like small bust adjustment or like narrow shoulder adjustment. I've always known that I had a small bust, but I did not realize that my shoulders were narrow or my rib cage was narrow or anything like that. I never noticed that. That might happen to you as you're sewing and like actually measuring your body, and that might be triggering for some people. Just focus on you're making something that's gonna fit your body rather than making your body fit into the garment. So definitely it's not always my favorite thing to measure myself, especially if I feel like my measurements have changed, but it's just important that my clothes fit me and not that, you know, I feel uncomfortable in my clothes. The other pattern that I would suggest if you're wanting to buy something is the Pomona pants by Anna Allen. And those pants are really awesome. I've made them in shorts form and they're very, very easy. It's just, yeah, simple pants pattern, high waist elastic pant. Very simple, can't go wrong. And with that, the Ogden cami and the Pomona pants, you can have an entire me-made outfit and you can take photos and show all your friends, and then everybody's going to want you to teach them how to sew. So I think that is all I have to say. Definitely pace yourself. I know that a lot of us will find a new hobby and immediately dive in and jump in and do so many things, but I would really suggest that you pace yourself and you take it slow. You take your time finding a good machine, and then you go out and you get all your supplies. You take your time thrifting the right garments to refashion or the right fabric to try and cut into. It's definitely very easy to get overwhelmed, and it's also very easy to just dive in and never look back. And that's one of the fun things about sewing, is that it doesn't take years and years and years to get good at sewing. Definitely years and years gives you that seasoned experience, like you've sewn a lot of garments, but at the end of the day, you could get really good at sewing after you've just made like 4 things. Because what is being good at sewing? It's just making something that you're proud of. It's just making something that looks nice, in your opinion, you know? So sometimes people make fun of my clothes that I make because, you know, they make me look older than I am, or they're really puffy and frilly or whatever, you know, not trendy currently, but I honestly don't care because I really like the clothes that I make and I'm really proud of them. It took me probably 4 or 5 garments to actually feel super comfortable with sewing. And at this point now, I've been sewing since, let's say 2017. At this point, I don't even feel like I need to look at the instructions most of the time because I'm looking at the pattern pieces as a puzzle. And when you make a lot of different things, you sort of understand how garments come together. And if you don't like a certain instruction, you can sort of do it your own way. So it's really fun. And again, it could take you a year to get really good at it, and it could take you 3 months to get really good at it. And that's something that I've learned, especially by being on sewing Instagram. Like the whole sewing community online has really shown me that it does not take years to get really good at sewing. And people who have been sewing for like 6 months are making things that I am still scared to make how many years later, right? So don't worry about you not ever being good at sewing or you not ever having success. Have patience for yourself and be willing to learn, be willing to try, and most of all, be willing to use that seam ripper. All right, you guys, if you have any additional questions on this topic, please feel free to leave them in the comment box below and I will answer them as I can. And if you have any answers for any of the questions down below, definitely feel free to, you know, give your advice as well, because I always want my videos to be a sort of forum of helpful advice for everybody around here. So thank you so much for watching and happy sewing in 2022. Bye.